1957's The Giant Claw is a fairly infamous creature feature that often gets dragged up for one of two reasons. Either it's used as a footnote as the inspiration for Larry Cohen's Cue the Winged Serpent, or it's often listed alongside movies like The Beast of Yucca Flats and Egar as examples of so bad it's good cinema. And I feel that's somewhat unfair really, as there's only one specific element of this film that falls down, and even then it's not so much that it falls down, rather it fails to live up to that preset expectations. You see, this is a film produced by one of the masters of atom age creature feature cinema, Sam Katzman, who you'll probably know best for having produced movies like Earth vs. the Flying Saucers or It Came From Beneath the Sea, amongst many, many other movies. He's a fair hand to have on board, managing to make a lot out of a modest or even small budget. Most notably, he had a strong working relationship with Ray Harryhausen. Now, according to folklore, and by that I mean multiple people on the internet, the story goes that when this movie was greenlit for production, it was understood that Harryhausen would be on board providing special effects for the titular Giant Claw, a demon bird that's at least the size of a battleship. He'd have been relatively fresh off working on Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, so expectations amongst the cast and crew were set pretty high that this was going to be the nastiest, most amazing looking stop-motion giant killer bird ever put to cinema. Unfortunately, this ended up not being the case. There are conflicting reports as to exactly why Harryhausen dropped off the project. Some people say he wasn't given enough money to work with, others say he was never involved in the first place, and some people put it down to other better paying jobs presenting themselves which drew him off the project before things really even began. This was around the time that Harryhausen was about to start his magnum opus works with Jason and the Argonauts and his Sinbad movies. But in any case, he was out, and that put Katzman in a situation because he now needed to find a creature for his creature feature. So, he did what anyone would do if they were in debt to a movie studio and on the verge of mental collapse. He fled to New Mexico and got a marionette puppet made for a speculated $50. He then shot the movie without clarifying that Harryhausen wasn't involved anymore and filmed the puppet scenes when everyone had wrapped filming. It's a bold move as a producer, I'll give him that, especially when the puppet looks like this. But that one action, just that one thing, has doomed this movie to a lifetime of Golden Turkey Awards and Worst Movie Ever Top 10 lists. Something that I personally feel is quite unfair. So, today, we're going to be taking a look at The Giant Claw with the aim of giving it a pardon from the Bad Movie Club. Obviously, I'm biased because I don't think it should be. So, I've reached out to an impartial adjudicator to hear my case, put his thoughts out there, and hopefully we might be able to change the conversations around this movie even just a little bit. So, without further ado, please welcome vintage cinema aficionado, movie critic, and all-round decent gent, Jonathan North. Jonathan, it's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I love movies. Actually, my channel is called I Heart Movies, and I love having conversations about all kinds of movies, even bad ones, so either way, we're going to have fun. I had never seen this movie before you suggested it for this video. I had actually never even heard of it, but I do love giant monster movies, and thanks to our friend Trivial Theater, I'm learning to love cheesy old ones with bad special effects, even if for no other reason than it makes for a great conversation. And I think this one fits that bill pretty nicely.
Lovely stuff. So, the actual plot of The Giant Claw is really quite basic, as we follow an electrical engineer called Mitch who works for the military in testing and piloting new aeroplanes. He's currently working on a new model with the help of a chief scientist, Sally Caldwell. And while on a routine test flight, Mitch spots something the size of a battleship that shoots past him at tremendous speeds. Mitch reports the UFO and almost immediately interceptors are scrambled to find out what exactly Mitch saw with orders to take it down. When Mitch gets back to the base, however, the mood is far from light, as the major of the base threatens to court-martial Mitch as the interceptors failed to find anything. The ground-based radars didn't spot anything either, and as a result of the interceptors going out, one of the squad lost contact with the base and has gone AWOL. But Mitch doubles down, adamant that he definitely saw something. Sally tries to rationalise the situation with Mitch, but he's having none of it. Only complicating matters further, a short time later, the Major receives a call from Air Traffic Control to report that a transporter plane containing 60 passengers and 2 pilots has now also gone missing without a trace under very similar circumstances. With a lot of questions up in the air, no pun intended, Mitch and Sally decide to head back to New York and let the military handle things. But while en route, the transport plane carrying them also gets attacked by this battleship-sized UFO, causing it to crash in a woodland and seriously injure the pilot. Mitch and Sally manage to escape the burning wreckage, having rescued the pilot, and the group finds sanctuary on a nearby farm owned by a Frenchman called Pierre, who takes them in, gives them homemade alcohol to calm their nerves, and calls an ambulance for the passed-out pilot. He also lets Mitch call the airbase to tell them that their plane was attacked and that they need to come and assess the wreckage and help get them back to New York. While waiting for the military to arrive, something scares Pierre's livestock, and when he goes to investigate, he barely makes it back with his life, as apparently a devil appeared in the sky to attack him. Eventually, the army arrives, they get the pilot into an ambulance and tell Mitch and Sally that a car will be arriving shortly to take them to the airport to complete their flight. They're also told that this is now a military matter and not to attempt to pursue things any further. A while later on the flight, Mitch gets up to some sexual assault while Sally continues a gaslighting campaign, and while these two awful but lovable people back and forth, Mitch realises something. He asks Sally to pass him a map and he marks all the plane disappearances out in X's. At first, it doesn't look like any of these attacks have rhyme or reason, but when Mitch draws a spiral out from the farm attack, all the other planes line up perfectly from it, meaning that whatever it is either searching for something in that spiral range or protecting something at the farm.
Elsewhere, a plane full of military personnel is on its way to investigate the incidents when suddenly they are attacked by a giant cartoon puppet vulture. I mean, a terrifying condor creature. It chomps their plane and the entire crew decide to bail, parachuting to safety. Safety in air quotes because the bird thing immediately swallows them all, kind of like a kid catching snowflakes on their tongue. In New York, Mitch and Sally are briefed about the other plane, and Mitch realizes he's the only person alive who survived flying next to this thing, but he has no proof and wishes he had a camera. This gives Sally an idea. She had recently been doing Earth curvature photography in the area of the attacks, and wonders if maybe she caught any footage of the creature. And what do you know she did? Oh, that all UFO photography would be this crystal clear. After a lot of cliched military dialogue, squadrons of planes are sent out to kill the bird. One of those squadrons manages to find it, and I think you can guess what happens next. Oh, the indignity of being eaten alive by a giant wart-covered puppet bird. Several scenes of exposition later, and we learn that the army has decided to nuke the bird, which seems like a wonderful idea. Nothing could possibly go wrong there. And also their top scientists have analyzed the wreckage from one of the attacks as well as several feathers left behind, and have revealed that this bird is actually an extraterrestrial being from an antimatter galaxy, which is just about the most obvious and logical explanation for its ability to avoid radar detection. Through much stock footage and screaming, we learn that the bird is now terrorizing the entire world, or at least the English-speaking world, as it seems to favor attacking the California coast, New York, some vaguely western US ranch-looking area locations, and also London for some reason. Sally visits Mitch, and after a chaste peck on the lips and some more exposition, she figures out that the bird must be building a nest. She says that it flies all around the world, never stopping, and only came down to the ground near Pierre's place. Therefore, it must have a nest there. Obviously. They head back to Pierre's, where they are met by the bird, who really seems to be exactly where the plot needs it to be at all times. It's super convenient. And speaking of super convenient, they don't need to spend much time searching for the nest at all. It's pretty much right in plain sight. They plan on shooting the eggs with shotguns, and Pierre nopes out immediately. Somehow, against all odds, and the fact that the bird is from an antimatter galaxy and therefore impervious to all forms of Earth-based weaponry, it lays eggs that are super fragile and easily penetrated by a single gunshot. Obviously, this infuriates the mama bird, so she flies off and kills poor Pierre. Since Pierre no longer needs his car, Mitch and Sally take it back to town to warn the army that they need to be on the lookout for more eggs, just in case. On the way back, they are overtaken by a carload of rowdy teenagers who are just begging to be murdered by a giant flying vulture from outer space. And they are. It's pretty unintentionally hilarious. The next day, or sometime later, I'm not really sure how much time passes between scenes in this movie, Mitch tells the general that he has come up with a very scientific-y way to breach the bird's antimatter defenses. I have no idea what it was, but he assures the general it would work. During a long montage of failure and random vulture destruction, Mitch finally gets his idea to work after purposely blowing his lab up for some reason. Then they head out to kill it while the bird eats the Empire State Building and the UN. For some reason, they have to build the machine on the plane while they're in the air. I'm sure they had a very reasonable explanation for not building it on the ground before they took off. But anyway, the bird starts chasing them while they're still trying to finish putting it together, so the general decides to kindly encourage them by repeatedly telling them to go faster. When the machine is done, Mitch fires it, the military fires their rockets, and the bird falls in the ocean. The end.
So the argument that I want to make isn't that this film is amazing when people are saying it's actually awful. I just want to move the needle on this thing from it's a bad movie to it's actually an okay movie that has special effects that, depending on your inclination, either drastically improve or drastically ruin this film. The actual script itself is pretty fun as far as creature feature flicks go, with plenty of airplanes being destroyed, railways being torn up, buildings being destroyed, and pilots being eaten alive. One of the last things you can accuse this movie of is being boring. There's a pretty decent 3-act structure in place with a clear beginning, middle, and end point. Our characters all have ample opportunity to develop and grow across the narrative, and there is at times some genuine peril and risk presented to our characters. The dialogue's got this nice mid-50s, fast-talking, fluid, loose-lipped approach to it, and even when it gets a bit cringy, it's positively charming in its pursuit of just delivering a fun time for the audience. This is a ghost train ride of a movie for all intents and purposes. Now, that's not to say that this film is particularly coherent. There is a massive slice of bullhunky in the third act where they realise that they have to explain why this battleship of a bird is indestructible and can't be seen on radar. So they just come up with some nonsense about how it must have come from a different planet where animals have antimatter shields they can just throw up and drop down on a moment's notice. Which explains why it can't be killed with conventional weapons and why it can't be seen on radar. It's hokey science fiction at its finest, which, while in the moment does seem a bit far-fetched, is really actually kind of well suited to these kinds of 50s monster movies. A lot of films from this time had creatures from different planets or dimensions, often with oddly specific ways to defeat them, and while the ending of this movie is a little bit anticlimactic and heavily reliant on that hokey science fiction gimmick, it is good enough for this genre. Like, it didn't exceed my expectations, but it didn't make me hate it either. Really, other than the science fiction element in this feeling a bit forced in and the ending feeling a little bit rushed, though not strictly a bad thing, the only actually bad thing I can honestly say about this script is that even with it only clocking in at 74 minutes-ish long, it still feels a little bit padded. I'm thinking it could have maybe lost 10 to 15 minutes comfortably and still have breathing space. Now, to the credit of Columbia Studios at the time, they also released an 8mm supercut version of this film, which does just about put the plot of the film across in a very succinct way, around 16 minutes. But in that instance, I feel the opposite problem is the issue. Now it's too concise, there's no room for the thing to breathe and just have fun. So yeah, it could probably be a really decent 50 to 60 minuter, but in its current form it's either a little too lofty or way overcut. There's just no middle ground.
I thought the script for this was fine-ish. The dialogue was probably full of pseudo-scientific and inaccurate military jargon, but I am neither a rocket scientist nor have I served in any branch of the military, so I don't want to say they are definitely just making stuff up as they went, but I have a hunch, just a slight one, that there wasn't a significant amount of research put into this plot. Which is fine. One of my favorite old movies is The Cat from Outer Space, which is probably on par with this one for military and scientific accuracy, so it probably would be hypocritical of me to judge them for any of this. I didn't go into this movie expecting a brilliantly coherent plot with believable explanations for everything. I went in expecting a 1950s B movie, and I got exactly what I was expecting.
The script was written by Samuel Newman and Paul Gangelin. Samuel has 34 writing credits, mainly for television, and other than this film, I'd say his biggest writing credits were for Perry Mason and Mannix. He unfortunately passed away in 1977 at the age of 57. As for Paul, he had 67 writing credits and a near 50-50 split between television and film work. This was probably, and infamously, his best known film, but on the TV front he wrote for Champion the Wonder Horse and Tales from Wells Fargo. He too sadly passed away in 1961 at the age of 62. As for the director, Jonathan, can you tell us anything about Fred F. Sears?
Frederick Francis Sears was an American film director and actor. He was actually also the narrator of this film, and he specialized in cheaply made films pumped out as quickly as possible, and he made a lot of movies. He seems to have been the epitome of the kind of guy who sees some kind of trend in Hollywood and just wants to jump on it right away. Fred Sears actually passed away in 1957, the same year this movie was released, but because he was such a prolific filmmaker, he actually had several movies released after he died, with 4 movies coming out in 1958.
On the direction front, what we have here is a clear and functional vision. Fred F. Sears was no stranger to shooting science fiction and fantasy, and here I think he does a more than admirable job, especially given the effects he had to work with. While it's easy to look back at these effects with the wonders of CGI and complex animatronics and sneer, Fred's direction here is an enveloping sensation, with quick cuts and lots of blink and you'll miss it rapid close-ups that really help you get to the heart of the action. While the padding may go some way to slowing it down, Fred has clearly worked with a very professional cast here to deliver energetic and considered performances that more than meet the standard of your average B-movie feature. While it could be argued that the cast are a little frosty around using their set space to its fullest potential, it is worth bearing in mind that this is the mid to late 50s and this film was predominantly shot on a soundstage. While there are examples of movies that utilise their set spaces more effectively from around this time, film was still quite in its infancy on a technical level and was largely still perceived to be theatre's less cooler, less effective sibling. I mean, hell, outside of movies that were shot on location, it would be around another 5 to 10 years before film and television would push past the standards of walk into shot, speak lines, walk out of shot, usually with a camera operator and director frantically gesturing to the cast to make sure they were in shot and in focus. So for a low to medium budget production like this, I'd honestly say they probably pulled the best they could out of it given its budget and tools they had to work with.
I think Fred's work here is perfectly serviceable for what he was trying to do. The special effects obviously leave something to be desired, but on the whole, I think his vision for what this film needed to be was met. This isn't really auteur cinema after all, this is a 1950s B-movie, and that's what it was meant to be, so judging it on those standards, I think it's perfectly fine.
On the cine front, I think this film handles itself rather well. They've clearly clocked here that they need to be sparing on how much they can show of the giant, somewhat rubbish bird puppet, but at the same time they also know that people have come here to see a giant bird attack New York. So, they compromised, hiding the bird through blurry quick cuts and close-ups that only show you bits of its claws, wings, and occasionally its face. They make sure that when the bird's face is in close-up to Dutch it ever so slightly just to add a feeling of unease, and when they do go full body, they always shoot it on a slightly low angle to really drive home just how huge it's supposed to be. They really want to give this thing a sense of menace, even small things like rudimentary animatronics in the beak of the bird so that it can flare its nostrils are focused on in extreme close-ups that really do try to sell this thing. And while I don't quite think they managed that, I have to admire the effort they put into the shot types and sequence building to get you as close to that menacing feeling as possible. The non-bird sequences are relatively well constructed too. They're maybe a little slow by modern standards, but they're competently built, using close-ups, reverse shots of conversations, and even the occasional pan here and there to be really far out. They also utilise a lot of back projection and stock footage in this picture, with a not insignificant amount of the stock footage being from movies like Earth vs. the Flying Saucers and 1 Million Miles to Earth. For the time, it was more than serviceable, though I can absolutely see room for improvement here in hindsight. But at the end of the day, what's here I would say is solid. Not award-winning stuff, but then it isn't really trying to be. This is a movie for older kids and teenagers to either goof on or get a dose of escapism for 60 to 80 minutes. And when it's contextualised like that, I can't honestly say I think it's that bad.
This film looks about as well as you would expect this kind of movie to look, with the obvious exception of the special effects. Those ranged from kind of cheesy and cheap to laughably bad. And I do mean laughably literally. I literally laughed out loud when the giant vulture swooped down on the carload of teenagers and carried off the car, only to drop it and have it explode midair. Except it looked like a little kid's Hot Wheels car that had firecrackers stuck in it. The explosion looked more like it popped into several pieces that fell to the ground, rather than a violent, fiery detonation on impact.
Performance-wise, we have a pretty decent roster on our hands, with Jeff Morrow and Mara Cordy as Mitch and Sally really bringing an animated, slightly snarky but genuine performance to proceedings that holds up through most of the runtime. There are a few moments where the plot convenience forces lines up that I don't feel would have been said without a bit more of a slower character development, and equally the film does the rather unfortunate and slightly uncomfortable thing of having Mitch force himself onto Sally, which is problematic. Sally equally though is no saint either, full on gaslighting Mitch right up to the point where literal photographic evidence is provided, and even then she's still a bit hesitant to get on board with the idea. I suppose it's a testimony to the performance of these leads that they played these imperfect characters so well that I got mildly annoyed by their actions in this. So in that sense, they're great. Not to be outshone though, full credit also has to go to Maurice Ancram and Robert Shane as General Considine and Buzzkirk respectively. They both played military characters multiple times across their careers, and here they're just as strong as ever in a role that largely would have been second nature by this point. They flank our main characters throughout the movie and are absolutely solid for most of the runtime. In fact, the only supporting cast I notably had any issue with is there's a scene where Mitch and Sally are racing away from the farm and a group of teenagers speed past them on a buggy. These teens are awful. One of them says "Daddy-o" unironically multiple times. They are literally the most uncool, badly performed teens I have seen in a long time. And the only truly awful set of performances in the whole movie. I honestly have no idea why the scene even really exists, because it doesn't add anything to the main plot and it never comes up again either. It's just so weird.
The performances here were all fine. They could get borderline cheesy at times, but I blame the plot and dialogue for that more than I do the actors. I think all the actors did their very best with what they had to work with, and gave believable enough performances. I've seen some cheesy movies where the acting made me literally, physically cringe. This one was in no way like that. The story and special effects may have been ridiculous, but these actors delivered their lines well enough to, sometimes, distract from how weird everything was. And at least our leads were actually good actors, and when not trying to rattle off ridiculous plot exposition, their characters were actually pretty believable. Which shouldn't be a surprise. Jeff Morrow was actually a Shakespearean stage actor, and Mara Corday was apparently once described by film critic Leonard Maltin as having more acting ability than she was permitted to exhibit.
And finally, the soundtrack. And being honest, it is a tad generic for this fodder. It's an all-string and orchestral arrangement playing booming, spooky-sounding, intense music that's the stalwart of this entire genre. If you've ever seen a monster movie from 1940 to 1960, odds are you've heard some variation of the soundtrack that sits on this thing. That's not strictly a bad thing, because there's a reason that this kind of music was used for damn near 30 years on every horror and science fiction film put out around the time. It's because it's effective at giving an instant sense of dread and peril. It doesn't matter that you could pretty much chop and change the score between 200 different films and no one would really know the difference outside of die-hard aficionados. For what it's trying to achieve, it works. Could it have been more unique? Absolutely. But for what it is, this is a fine, settled offering that isn't cheap sounding, even if it is a tad generic.
Totally agree on the soundtrack. It's the definition of fine. Nothing stood out to me in either a good or a bad way. It was simply there to be background music.
As mentioned earlier, in the early 1960s, Columbia Picture released a supercut version of The Giant Claw on 8mm film for home playback. This wasn't really intended to be considered a full home release, but it was common practice right up until the mid to late 70s to release movies in best of formats. The idea being that if you'd been to the cinema and seen the film in full, this was the closest you could get to owning the film at home, short of going out and buying a 16mm film projector and hunting down rogue reels of the film. Occasionally these had linking narration, but sometimes it would quite literally just be the best bits of the movie between 7 and 20 minutes long, shoved on some 8mm reels with no context. It's a terrible way to see the film for the first time, but a decent solution to owning the film in the days before VHS. The Giant Claw took a while to make its VHS debut, releasing in 1996 by Videolog. I have managed to find another release that may predate this 96 release, but I can't find any other information on it than a front cover, the look of which would suggest it was earlier than 96 but no earlier than 90. So if you owned a copy of The Giant Claw in the UK between 1990 and 1995, do let me know, as I'd love to learn more about that release. It didn't receive a DVD release in the UK, but it did come out on Blu-ray under Arrow Video in 2021 as part of the Cold War Creatures collection, a 4-disc set compiling some of the best films of Sam Katzman. And I was absolutely blown away by this set. The films look lovely, with each one given a lengthy intro by film critic Kim Newman. There's full feature commentaries for each film alongside video essays, trailers, the 8mm film supercuts for 3 of the 4 films, and the set itself comes with 2 booklets, one a detailed art guide for all the films in the set and another compiling written essays about Cold War creature feature movies and the works of Sam Katzman. Throw in some posters, lobby cards and reversible artwork and you have a set that, while to me might not be worth the current $59.99 RRP, is definitely worth the $39.99 price it periodically drops to when it goes on sale. It's absolutely worth checking this set out. I first heard of the Giant Claw on Cinemassacre's Monster Madness years ago, and it wasn't until 2020 that I was finally able to watch a full HD copy of the film via the Horror Channel. And at the time, I was absolutely blown away by just how fun this movie was. It's a little long-winded for people who struggle with older movies, but I personally found it to be a laugh riot, with some serious melodrama, decent casting, solid direction and cine, and a can-do attitude in the face of adversity. It's by no means a perfect film. It does get lost a bit in pseudoscience at times, and the ending is a little bit of a damp squib given how dramatic the rest of the film is. But minor quibbles and slightly dodgy puppets aside, there's a lot to love about this film, and I really sincerely think it should be reappraised at least a little bit in terms of how it's perceived. It's not quite as bad as people say it is, but what say you, Jonathan?
No, I think this doesn't deserve to be thought of as a bad movie. It's definitely not an amazing film by any stretch, but even though it's not technically a good film, it's still entertaining, and even laugh out loud hilarious at times, whether or not that was intentional. I won't be adding this to my favorite movies anytime soon, but I had a lot of fun watching it for this video, and sometimes it's more fun to talk about these kinds of movies than it is just to watch them. But while that definitely is the case here, I still did have fun just watching it. There were so many unintentionally hilarious moments that you can't help but enjoy the 1950s weirdness. I even thought it was hilarious how the movie just ended. Like, well, the bird's dead now. Bye!
Thanks again, man, and I hope this one wasn't too rough for you. I'll be sure to pop a link to your channel in the description of this video, but for folks at home, how are they best finding you, and what have you got coming up?
Well, like I said at the beginning, my channel is called Ahhh Movies, and I'm mostly a podcaster at this point. I do occasionally do shorter reviews, but I really enjoy having conversations about movies more than just talking to myself, so I mostly stick to podcasts these days. I also have a second channel/podcast called Every Version Ever, where every few months I pick a new story and try to watch as many adaptations of it as possible. I've done The Secret Garden, War of the Worlds, A Christmas Carol, just to name a few. I'm currently doing a series on Alice in Wonderland, and I think I'll be doing Cinderella next. I try to have a wide variety of guests on both my shows, so if you're on the fence about me, I bet you'll enjoy some of my co-hosts. Between the two shows, we talk about all kinds of things, from an unsettling stop-motion 1988 Czechoslovakian version of Alice in Wonderland, to the Star Wars Holiday Special, to The Legend of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole. I think there's literally something for everyone. If any of that sounds interesting, I'd love to have you stop by. Thanks for having me. I'll have to have you on my show one of these days as well.
Lovely stuff. So, I've pled my case, the jury's out. What do you think? Should the Giant Claw languish in bad movie hell, or do you think it deserves a reappraisal? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, till next time.